Thank you, Beatrice. Hi, everyone. Welcome to our session. Before we share our thoughts on using participatory democracy and sociocracy to do some transformation on a few levels, we did want to give a brief introduction to Ingrid and I. So my name is Kristina Banks. I use she, her pronouns. I'm based in New York City, and I am a co-executive director. There are three of us. I'm one of the co-EDs at PBP. And I've been working for PBP for a little over 5 years now, doing a lot of focus on implementing and directing our management circle or management work, so operations, finances, and human resources, and like the ways that we support the team. So I'll pass it to Ingrid to do an introduction.
Hi, folks. Really glad to be with you this afternoon or whatever time it may be where you are. My name is Ingrid Haftel. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm based in Brooklyn, New York. I'm the Director of Community Education at the Participatory Budgeting Project, where I'm a part of our org circle, but also the program circle, and I also run the Participation Lab sub-circle. I'll pass it back to you, Kristina.
Cool. So we work for PBP, Participatory Budgeting Project, and at PBP, we support partners to address some of the biggest challenges to democracy and community participation in decision-making. So as part of like an international movement that was established in over 7,000 cities across the globe, PBP has funded or founded and supported the first PB process in the US, in the United States, in Chicago of 2009. So we first started in 2009. Our focus was on participatory budgeting. And then in 2020, so last year, 2022, we expanded our mission to transform democracy to center community power. So this is looking at the broader participatory democracy sort of movement field, which includes participatory budgeting. So we're no longer doing PB, we're just like including PB in a larger scope of practices for community-led decision-making. And so currently we work together with municipalities and organizations across the US and Canada to grow and support the expansion of participatory democracy in their communities. And so we have a remote staff that are based, I think, in every time zone in the US at this point, but large-ish staff and growing at the moment. And so now I'll sort of go into like, what is participatory budgeting? And so PB, participatory budgeting, is a participatory democratic process that involves everyday people making real decisions about real money. So it's not a consultation of these community members, and it's not a one-time event. Ideally, it's an annual cycle of meetings and voting that gets incorporated into the budget process. So it's not for the whole budget of like a municipal budget or an organizational budget. Rather, it's like a portion of funds. So discretionary funds that can be used or set aside that's not set aside for fixing expenses. And while every process can vary in some ways to meet specific needs of the local community, generally the process is comprised of these 6 sort of phases. So first, it starts with designing the process with a representative group of community members forming a steering committee to really write the rules of the PB process for how the process will operate or how folks will engage in the process. After those rules are set, members of the broader community are invited to brainstorm ideas for how the money might be spent. So really putting forward ideas that would help to improve their community or improve their livelihood within the community. And then once those collected ideas are sort of collected and brainstormed, they are then turned into concrete proposals that are feasible, align with the goals and the needs of the process, and any other criteria that is set by the steering committee. So this could look like impact on equity or anything like very specific to the local needs, so like right size the equity measures there. And then also part of that sort of vetting process is determining what a budget might look like for the proposals that have been developed. And then the next phase is like the vote phase, where we move from vetting proposals into engaging the community and sort of deciding and voting on the proposals on the ballot. So this is where the community members can really decide what is their priority for them and what might be helpful for their community themselves. One vote phase is ended, we sort of tally up the votes to then determine which of those projects were rises to the top. So which projects will get funded until the money runs out. So the way that the vote sort of happens is a part of the design process where they determine how sort of specific projects will be funded depending on what's available for the funding. And then also like the implementation of the projects will also happen during the implementation phase. And then finally, we will move into the evaluation process where the process is evaluated, refined, and ideally we'll start to set up the next cycle of the process so that it doesn't become a one-off event. So this way that PB, participative budgeting, can be like a new way of engaging a community and deciding how to spend money on a recurring basis. And at its heart, this process is a method for sharing power and making community-led decision-making happen. And so there are certainly different contexts that this sort of process can be applied. And we'll go into a couple of examples how we, PPP, have supported municipalities and organizations in implementing PB processes. And then later, Ingrid will talk about some systemic transformation pieces. One example of a PB process that we supported is from Boston, where there was the process called Youth Lead the Change in the city of Boston. And so this process started in 2014, and it now happens every 2 years, where the youth between the ages of 12 and 25 direct how to spend $1 million in infrastructure improvements. So what's really great about this process is like the emphasis in engaging traditionally marginalized and underserved neighborhoods and identities, including youth being at the core of this process. And a fun fact is that through PPP's support of this process, we now work directly with 2 youth who were a part of the original Youth Lead the Change PPP processes in Boston. One of them is a project manager helping to implement PB processes across the US. So we have an actual staff member at PPP. And then we have another Boston PB Youth Lead the Change member who serves on the board of directors. So they're a youth member on our board. And then the other example that we wanted to share with you is how we as an organization practice what we preach internally through a process called PB Squared. So this is a yearly process that we do to really engage our broad network of partners and supporters to participate in this internal process, but also to learn about PB and how they can like bring it to their own communities. And through that, we are able to like innovate PB through this PB Squared internal process. And how we sort of determine, or how we sort of determine like the pot of funds for this process is we use a percentage of our individual donations on a yearly basis to determine like what amount of money do we want to then allow our supporters and base to decide how the projects that we're sort of working toward as an organization. And with PB Squared, we have been able to resource and support projects that can be harder to fundraise traditionally for. So for example, we've funded projects that will sort of benefit our staff well-being and researching for experimentation and emerging programs and projects that we might then incorporate into the organization. So that's a little bit about who we are as an organization and ways that we're using participatory democracy to center for community power. We also wanted to share how PVP as an organization is transforming on an organizational sort of plane using PD and sociocracy more specifically. So this next slide is sort of the journey that we've had to come to sociocracy in this space. So our journey started in 2020 after some reflections on the challenges that we were sort of having, the way that we were previously collaborating, and a desire for our internal structure and practices to really mirror in line with our vision and mission as an organization related to community-led decision-making. So previously we were using Darcy, which is a decision-making model that was in a way that conflated or combined project management pieces alongside decision-making responsibilities and roles, which created a challenge in the way that we collaborated and worked as a team. And through sort of this journey in 2020 and moving into 2021, we started to explore alternative ways and alternative decision-making models. And in 2021, I think it was towards the latter half of 2021, we decided as a team to really use and move forward incorporating sociocracy at PVP. We explored a few like alternative models. Sociocracy was one of them, obviously. We also looked at holacracy and worker-owned co-ops, and ultimately found that sociocracy was a clear intersection between participatory democracy, participatory decision-making, and participatory budgeting. So these were all sort of coalescing and had like deep alignment with what we were doing as an organization. And we found that by aligning our work and staff into a circle-based structure would enable us to step into building a leaderful organization and being really explicit about the autonomy our team and individuals have over the work that they are leading and holding. And then in 2022, this was sort of a focus of really creating and designing the structures that we need to implement within Sociocracy. So the focus on refining the processes and practices that we have, creating our circle structure that we need to align our team, and creating an operating sort of organizational framework. So we have an organizational framework that outlines the processes and our decision-making, our circle structures, and how we collaborate as an organization and within our circles also. And then we also created a circle structure that has our circle members, obviously the circle structure, and our aims, like what is guiding our work as a team. And then finally, in 2023, one highlight for, we're still starting out 2023, but one highlight for this year so far is that we used our circle structure to consent to our 2023 budget and goals, organizational goals. So this was the first time that we've used a consent process intentionally to gather all of our team's sort of consent on how we were working as an organization. And this was also the first time that we raised objections to our budget and our goals and really created a space for our team to like determine what was like right for us as an organization and them as individuals and team members to move forward. So still a lot of work, but we've come a long way. And so moving on to the next slide, we wanted to share like a snapshot of our circle structure. Very rudimentary, we just used it creating on a Google slide, but hopefully it provides a visual of how we align our team and our areas at the organization. Okay. So even with all of the work that we've done to get where we are today, we do recognize that there is more that we can learn and do as an organization to really lean into this organizational transformation and recognize that this is a continual learning journey, improvement process for us individually and us as an organization. And part of that journey is surfacing reflections and challenges that need to be addressed as they come up instead of waiting until years go by to do this reflection. So some reflections that we've surfaced so far is really the relationship to power and how it exists within our structure. So our staff structure, we are still a hierarchical organization in a sense that there are distinct levels of staff. So directors, managers, et cetera. So throughout this journey, we've been reflecting on how power shows up within the circle-based structure and our staff structures to really align like what we're trying to create as an organization of having sharing power and sharing decision-making ability across all of our team and levels. Another reflection is that we are a highly collaborative organization, and there really needs to be clear balance between when we're able to move autonomously and when we need to like come together and be collaborative for a particular thing. The other reflection and maybe challenge is that we've unintentionally created silos through our circle structure. One area that we didn't really focus on when we were creating this circle-based structure and organizational framework was the double linking. So the flow of information between circles to connect all of the work that we're doing to align our areas as an organization. And then maybe what we are planning to do moving forward is like strengthening our sociocratic practices at PBP. So again, doing some shared learning as a team to really lean into sociocracy and having some shared understanding and language of our framework. A need for continual iteration, experimentation. So for example, we try to lift up in our decision-making spaces the phrase from Sociocracy for All, good enough for now, safe enough to try. So not like letting that fear stop us from moving forward as a team. Other thing is that we're going to be updating our circle structure aims and also creating domains and also the double linking in the next month or so. Cool. So this is a very high level look at our internal transformation. I'll hand it over now to Ingrid to talk a bit about how we're using participatory democracy and sociocracy to transform systems.
Thanks so much, Kristina. Yeah, so again, you've just heard about kind of transformation within our organizational culture and the links between participatory budgeting and kind of our implementation of sociocracy. And what we wanted to do is actually expand outward a little, and then we're going to zoom all the way inward to kind of individual transformation. But right now, expanding outward a little bit to consider how both sociocracy and participatory democracy, also including participatory budgeting, can help us change inequitable and oppressive systems. So the concepts that we use and which we consider sociocracy to be a part of and essential to like helping us sharpen these practices are participatory democracy, you've already heard us use that term, and community-led decision-making. So what we want to do is just take a moment to kind of look at what we mean when we say participatory democracy and community-led decision-making. And what we'd like to do is a little dramatic reading in order to go a little bit deeper on these concepts and talk about the connections between them. So I'm wondering if I may I need 4 volunteers to help us with a dramatic reading of this zine that we're going to look at. That's all about participatory democracy and community-led decision-making. And if you can volunteer in the chat, you can also throw up your hand, that's fine. But if you're comfortable reading for us, being a dramatic reader, I would be so grateful for your participation. Mara, Nina, wonderful. Okay, we've got 2 volunteers, we need 2 more. Jerry, thank you so much. Do we have 1 more volunteer? Maybe? Shayla, beautiful. Okay, so here's our order. Mara, Nina, Jerry, Shayla in the chat. And Mara, I'll hand it off to you for this first page of our participatory democracy zine.
Okay, so you just want me to dramatically read what's on the screen? So
yes, and dramatic can be to your interpretation. You do not need to, you can totally like go for it, or you can be more restrained if you prefer.
Okay, all right, we'll give this one. This should be interesting. Okay. What is participatory democracy? Who decides who benefits? Participatory democracy is what happens when we can all participate in policy making, budgeting, and other decisions that impact our lives. Community-led decision making equals participatory democracy practices that share decision making power. How do we make sure that we have a positive impact? Participatory democracy practices are only as equitable, accessible, and significant as we design them to be. So who decides and who benefits? We can create democratic practices that are more inclusive than traditional elections. They can include young people, people who have been or are incarcerated, and people of all immigration statuses.
Mara, beautiful. Thank you so much for that reading. We're going to continue the play here. And Nina, I wonder if you can read this next one for us.
Yeah. How do we make sure that we have a positive impact? Participatory democracy must be equitable, which means it centers community members who are marginalized or excluded from decision making. Accessible, removing physical, language, economic, and other barriers to participation. And significant, focuses on processes with power over meaningful budget and policies.
That was beautiful, Nina. Thank you so much. Jerry, could you read this page of the book for us?
Examples of community-led decision-making practices. Participatory budgeting. Community members come together to decide how to spend public money. Participatory policymaking. Community members come together to design and decide on policies. Policy juries. A representative group of people convene to produce a decision or statement on policy. And ballot initiatives. Voters directly create, amend, and appeal laws by first gathering signatures from a minimum number of supporters. Plus sociocracy.
Beautiful. Plus sociocracy. Thank you. The addendum. No big deal. Thank you so much, Jerry. Shayla, can you please bring us home here?
This is a global movement. Community-led decision-making has deep roots in our Black and African American, Indigenous, and immigrant cultural traditions. Nothing about us without us.
Shayla, that was wonderful. Could I please get some reactions, appreciation for our fantastic presenters? And just so you all know, that set my heart afire. And to hear your beautiful words in concert with these images, which we would be remiss if we didn't say, were created by artist and illustrator TK Din. And you can download a version of the zine for your very own self. I think Kristina just dropped a link to the zine in the chat. So please download it. And much appreciation and credit for the artist who created this. But right there, so our desire is to, if you don't already think about sociocracy this way, and I bet you do, but if you don't, or we hope that we can continue this conversation, that sociocracy is a way forward, a way of deepening a practice that is deeply connected to practices of participatory democracy that, again, have deep roots across our cultural traditions and are about shifting systems away from oppression, away from domination. And I know that's at the very heart of sociocracy. And that's you know, I think what gets the PBP team excited about doing participatory democracy and doing participatory budgeting, that big picture potential to change ourselves, but also change our world. And we know it's a slow and complicated and difficult project, but we really think that that systemic transformation is important to think about and to kind of keep as a North Star. And some of the analogies and connections between sociocracy and participatory democracy that just kind of bubbled up as we were working on this presentation. We know that decentralized decision-making is at the heart of sociocracy. And the way that shows up sometimes in our organizing or in the organizing of the folks that we're supporting on the ground to do things like participatory budgeting is through explicit conversations around power sharing and a power analysis. In terms of the circle structure, I think one way, one area for us as an organization that helps people implement participatory democracy practices is to look at the way we organize like committees and delegates and assemblies. Those are kind of the bodies, the organizations of people, and how can we use the philosophy of circles and the way that circles operate to help those types of bodies operate better and in a more decentralized way. When I think about feedback in sociocracy, I also think about the values of cycles and emergence and iteration. As Kristina said, participatory budgeting should never just be a one-off deal. And it also needs to be a place where we try things and fail and learn from that. And that's good information. And so I think there are connections there. And I think some other analogies and connections between consent and also the act of voting, the act of having voice in decision-making. These are some of the explicit, I think, like connections and analogies between these practices. And I think we are very interested in seeing how we can continue to think about how sociocracy can shape the way we advocate for participatory budgeting and democracy and how we help folks implement it. Just on the topic of kind of systemic transformation, I think we wanted to share a couple of examples of the possibilities here that I think are particularly important to us and alive for us right now. One of these is a process that's happening in Seattle that is rooted in community demands that came directly out of the murder of George Floyd in the summer of 2020. And not just that, but a long history of Black-led organizing in Seattle against displacement, against over-policing, against racialized violence and capitalism. And so this is actually an example of where the city of Seattle cut $12 million from the Seattle Police Department budget and dedicated that funding to be decided through participatory budgeting. And specifically to directly invest in Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities. And we have this caveat here, consistent with applicable law, because this is getting more and more complicated in the US. As folks might know, there are laws around how we can use racial equity in our laws, in the distribution of resources, that is really an effect of far-right organizing. So this is a really complicated topic to take up. Another goal of the process is to really increase the ownership and participation of city residents in the solutions of the city's most pressing needs. So this is really an example of how participatory democracy can be used to change systems through divestment and through investment of community-defined definitions of safety, community safety, and what it means for communities to be able to thrive. We know that there are challenges to doing this work. They're big ones for sure. Some of the ones we think about are like lack of buy-in and follow through. When it comes to people in power, right? To some extent, we have to have the buy-in of leaders in order to do the system changing work right now. And that's the reality of some of this organizing for sure. There's also the risk of losing the connection to the history of struggle that our movements for change are really rooted in. And I think that can even be relevant to our own organizations and formations. Changes in leadership means sometimes you lose momentum. That's a big barrier. And then lack of exposure and practice with these kinds of participatory democracy practices. We know that this isn't going to happen overnight. It's iterative, and these are muscles that we're building. When I was reflecting on some of these challenges, it also helped me reflect on the fact that these are some of the same challenges that our organization has faced in implementing sociocracy. So again, I see deep connections between these practices. And I think we see, again, a lot of potential for us at PBP to continue to think about how sociocracy can implement or can influence the way that we advocate for and implement participatory democracy. I just wanted to lift up two more exciting examples kind of in the realm of systemic transformation that are really about people kind of facing those barriers to systemic change and not letting that stop them. One of them is a process that's taking shape in Milwaukee, where the city of Milwaukee has said, no, we're not going to do participatory budgeting. We know what we're doing. We don't need a more participatory process. And a group of organizers called the African American Roundtable has said, no, we need real decision-making power over how resources are spent in our city. And if you're not going to do it, we're going to do it. And we're going to do it with $40,000 of our budget. And we're not going to let that lack of institutional buy-in stop us. And another example, not participatory budgeting, but participatory planning and policymaking, something that I've been excited to follow is what's being called community-driven participatory zoning in Chicago. So this is an alderperson in Chicago who is giving community members a direct decision-making say over land use decisions in their neighborhoods. So neighbors get together and they get to literally vote up or down whether zoning changes, new developments, changes to code can happen. It's not a binding vote, but the alderperson has a commitment to implement what the community wants. And so I think we're excited about these kinds of examples. Again, just showing the power and potential for participatory democracy to really change unjust systems. With that, I'm going to pass it back over to Kristina, who's going to talk a little bit more. We were here. We went up here. Now we're going to like zoom all the way down to the individual and talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, thank you, Ingrid. So we just wanted to briefly share some reflections on Ingrid's and my personal sort of journey through our work at PBP, specific to like transformation using sociocracy and participatory democracy. So a couple of reflections that I have over the course of my time at PBP is one is just like a reflection of my role as a co-executive director at the moment. So this has led me to like really be thoughtful about how I show up in our team spaces to intentionally share that power with the rest of the team. So creating space for others to step up when they might have information or knowledge or experiences to like contribute to a discussion, and knowing when my leadership and my voice is kind of necessary or would be needed for varying circumstances and context. The other reflection that I just wanted to briefly touch on is related to my role within operations and management spaces. So this role can often be go mode all the time to get things done. And so I'm really learning how to slow down and creating processes and systems that intentionally thinks about the team needs. So what context, what information, or how much time or space do they need to process the work that we're doing together? And so I think ultimately shared decision making and sociocracy working within this framework is hard and time intensive. And sometimes I forget about that. So just like taking a moment to say, like, it's okay that we're not moving fast enough per like our timelines that we created, as long as we get there in the end. And so there might be a winding journey instead of a straight line to our destination, but always keeping that sort of endpoint as like a guiding star. And I think lastly, one thing that I've been sort of chatting about with our team is that this sort of model requires a shift in perspective and thinking. So you can't go into this with like the same habits, new habits and new sort of processing that thought partnership is required for this to be successful. Pass to Ingrid.
Thanks, Kristina. Yeah, I'll just share one reflection in particular about kind of individual transformation. I, like so many of us, have had a really lonely and difficult pandemic. I also became a mother during the pandemic in New York City, which was hard to get out and about. And I experienced that also in my facilitation and in my ability to connect with other folks through this little box or boxes. I now have 2 screens. I needed it after a while. And I've been a facilitator for a while and an educator for a while, and was really continue to find it really difficult to create the quality connections that I found in person spaces. But I think for good and for bad, like this is, virtual space is a reality, and it is creating access for folks who didn't have access before. And one of the things that I feel I'm trying to find the right word. I should have written it out beforehand, but so grateful for in the practice of sociocracy is the way that it helps me embody interdependence, particularly in virtual space. I find rounds and the practice of consent as a way of really making visible like our collective presence and our bonds in a way that I just didn't have access to before I learned how to facilitate through sociocracy, even when it feels awkward or performative, like in virtual space in particular. And I haven't had the chance to facilitate in IRL in some time, but I'm finding that these practices are sustaining me as a facilitator and helping me remind me of our interdependence in a way that I think I would be sorely missing if I didn't have in my toolbox. So we wanted to share just a couple of small, I think in Kristina's case, actually really big ways that this is kind of transforming our work. And so with that, I'm going to hand it back to Kristina, because what we want to do is actually move into a little bit of an activity with folks.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks everyone for your engagement and participation throughout our presentation. We will switch gears now to do a bit of getting you all to think about sharing your lessons and learnings across movements. So first, we'll start with a bit of silent reflection on the 2 questions that you see on your screen, or anything else that you're taking away with you from this presentation. So we'll do about 3 minutes of individual reflection, some silent journaling, and then we'll move into the small breakout groups of 3 to discuss those reflections. So having some cute conversation amongst the folks that are in the room. And then we'll come back after about 7 or so minutes to do a chatterful exercise to share any key takeaways that you're sort of leaving the space with. And then after this activity, we will open up for questions from you all if you have any. But yeah, any questions on this activity before we go into some silent journaling time? Maybe type your last remaining thoughts, and then we'll hit enter in 3, 2, 1. Wow, great. Cool. So you spoke about community involvement and budgets, which is helpful for organizational budgets, adding community input to important budget conversations, delegating power, a need for a paradigm shift, that's great, and whether it's vote or consent. So maybe that's a question that we can talk through in a bit. But we'll add these reflections, and feel free to keep adding them to the chat, y'all. That would be helpful to the slide that we shared with y'all if you want to come back. That's me, if it's an ambulance going by, to the chat and the slide deck. But I guess we'll now open up to you all to see if you have any questions that you'd like to talk through throughout anything that came up for you through this presentation. And you can feel free to drop those questions in the chat or come off mute and speak into the space.
Oh, I've got a question. Go ahead. No.
I know Samara raised her hands.
Jerry, do you want to go first?
Oh, no, go ahead.
Okay. I was just curious, a lot of what you seem to be doing, like the examples that you gave and where you guys work tend to be larger cities. And I'm wondering if you have any experience in kind of rural areas or rural organizations and how participatory budgeting is maybe different with them.
I'm not sure if you wanted to take this, but I can share that we haven't really engaged a rural area at the moment in terms of PB process, unless I'm missing an area or a city, Ingrid. But yeah, so we tend to do larger cities or municipalities just because I don't know why, but I think what we're trying to do is expand into the rural areas for not just focusing on those larger cities. Ingrid, did you have any examples of rural cities?
Yes, I am happy to provide a few. And it's true, we have had lots of conversations with really small and more rural areas in the United States. And I think we've got small cities, towns, municipalities for sure. And I think a recent example, we worked with Central Falls, Rhode Island School District, which is it's a small city, but in the middle of Rhode Island. And it was a school district there with COVID funding. So it was actually using participatory budgeting. Money came to schools through, I think it was ARPA, the American Rescue Plan Act. And they did a process there. And that was an example of a smaller size municipality. We recognize a huge gap in our practice in terms of working with folks in rural areas, working in the US South. So there are big gaps, I think, in where PB is being implemented. And that's something that we're actually working to hopefully address in part through our work with the Democracy Beyond Elections Coalition, which is a national coalition of organizations, including folks in the South, like the Highlander Center, and folks who work specifically, I think, in ways that can hopefully help us address those gaps.
Jerry?
I can go. So I have the, this is kind of a question, I guess. One of our local banks does a voting process. So it's kind of like participatory budgeting, because you get to vote and then they give the money away according to the votes. So the winner is always the local animal shelter. And so it's how do you deal with the dolphins win, the dogs and cats win, or the charismatic person who can make a really good argument, not necessarily what's really most valuable and important? How do you deal with that within, voting process, I guess?
I'm laughing because I have a dog park down the street. That's great. It was a PB project. Wonderful. But it's not actually what I think my neighborhood needs. But it's oh, give it to the dogs, need a space to run, right? And so, Jerry, this is a real thing that comes up. And I think my question is, how was the process designed to begin with? Was it designed with community members? Were they the ones coming up with impacted folks and folks who represent the community? Were they the ones coming up with the criteria for what kind of projects could end up on the ballot in the first place? So I think that's one place where we have to think about things being community-led and designing with, not for. And then the other place is in one of the powerful places, and I think this is a place where you could really dig in with sociocratic practice too, is actually in proposal development. So folks in participatory budgeting can submit ideas. Anyone can submit an idea. But then that idea is a little rough gem, and that gets polished through the proposal development process where community budget delegates come together, make sure it's feasible, refine it. And I think that's another place where rather than it always just being the charismatic person or idea that wins, that through that interaction, collaboration of turning an idea into a proposal, that's another place where there can be interventions, and making sure that like equity criteria and accessibility criteria are taken into account as we're shaping those projects. Kristina, I wonder, anything to add there?
Yeah, maybe just like during the evaluation phase, it might be helpful to like look at all the projects that have been funded in the previous years to see if there's like you're recognizing a trend. So like instead of keep going with the trend, like shift that trend to something that you want to see moving forward. So evaluation might be a helpful piece to maybe also touch on here.
Thanks, Ingrid and Kristina. And we have a couple of questions in the chat. Denise asks, what is your strategy to sustain sociocracy over time after the initial training? What do you answer about it?
Yeah, I can start, and then Ingrid, if you have any other reflections, please jump in. But I think and I'm assuming this is a question from like our internal sort of structure. But one thing that we know that we need to do is do more consistent, regular trainings with our team. So this has been a very long span of time for 3 years where we started the initial conversation, and there has been a cycling in and out of staff. So we recognize that there needs to be heavy onboarding related to like the way that we organize ourselves as a team, making sure that we are like training our new folks and getting them the information that they need or would be helpful to engage in this sort of process, and then also revisiting like the trainings with our full team. So we just recently did I think like a one-on-one type training with our full team with Sociocracy for All. So we're hoping to incorporate that sort of one-on-one training and future trainings related to specific areas that we'd like to grow in consistently over the course of the period of time that we're working within this framework. I'm not sure if that answered your question, or Ingrid, if there's anything, anything else.
Yes. Okay. Brenda has also a question. In what ways can the community provide their inputs into the budget?
I brought up our cycle diagram, Kristina, and Brenda sharing this again, realizing that we shared a lot of dense information. I just wanted to share this as this is the model of participatory budgeting that we advocate for, but it's just one way of doing it. And we recognize that there are others. And I think where we're also going to go when we wrap up is sharing some resources so you can learn more, including some tools that can give you really detailed explanations of how PB has been implemented in communities really across the globe. And I am Kristina. I know we have to be super mindful of time. So Nina, if you can, we would love to follow up with you, and let me actually go to where we share our contact information. Kristina, if you want to share anything as we close things out. I want to make sure that folks first can see that.
1 minute's time. Yeah, great.
And then I'm going to drop a link to this presentation in the chat so folks have it. I'll do that one more time. But Kristina, anything else as we close things out? All of that is in the chat for you now.
Great. So I want to say thank you to Kristina and Ingrid for this amazing and inspiring conversation, and for all of you to be here, and for your participation in these participatory budgeting topics. So thank you very much for all of you, and see you in the next conference. See you. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, everyone. Pleasure spending time with you.
See you.
Do we also leave? Should we like stick around, or?
Like,